All right, this is gonna work. All right, let me set this up. So this is our owl. The owl will hoot at us. I'm gonna ask you guys to come in a little bit closer because you're pretty far away.
Hi, Len.
Hello, how are you?
Very good.
Well, hello, Ezra, Aaron, Janet, Cheryl, David.
Hi. Hello.
Hello.
Very good command of the names.
Well, they're right in front of me.
Oh, the names are on written. Okay, my screen doesn't have that.
I think I'll put a different background in. Let's see here.
Put, oh, I see.
Let's,
Nice backyard.
yeah, I was gonna take a dive in a little bit.
Yeah.
Why don't I go to somewhere where it's, outside it's pretty nice like that.
Very nice.
There, that's my house.
Michael, will this table be okay?
Yeah, that table's fine. Hey, welcome.
Well, at least this saves me 45 minutes of driving, but I'd rather be there in person.
And next time I'll take you with me.
Oh, there's more people there. I have an arrow to go to, or I'll go to gallery view. Oh, much more. How many people are in the basement there?
We've got about 8 of us right now. Okay. I don't think we're in-
Turn the heat up. About 11:30. It takes a little bit. I have to warm it up.
Liberty Valley Church.
Oh,
There was people that think it is.
what did they say?
It's like, it's anonymous kind of thing, but they did put the Liberty Valley Church.
That is like gonna be my question.
Map the world, it seemed like.
Yeah,
Because as a temple, we really couldn't.
that's right. How could they do this? Very- Well, they showed up at his house.
Where are they located?
Macedonia.
Oh,
Okay.
Well,
I didn't know.
with the legends that out there.
Oh, here it goes.
Bells on.
Julius, are you sleeping over there?
Oh,
Sides.
that's just what I'm trying to figure out. Yeah.
Hello,
Hello, Julius.
how you doing?
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe that's it.
Yeah, just a second.
tempted to put a trailer after my name. Let's see how this looks.
I don't know, we're not getting, I don't think we need it right now, but we need the speaker. Are we hearing Len from here?
I
Certainly loud enough.
Yeah.
I think so.
You took the little box out that was in the big box.
Yeah. All right, well. Ezra, do me a favor, do a sound check with me real quick.
Sound check, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me?
One more time.
I am talking. Can you hear me? I've had a good day today. I'm not sure that's what you guys want to know, but I'll tell you about my good day. I had some Lindor chocolates. They're great.
Very happy. I'm very happy to hear you had a good day.
So Ezra, that's great. Thank you about your chocolate escapade. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is wonderful to be here. We are about 95% set up. We have, as you can see behind me, the screen projected so that we can see our Zoom participants there. We also have a fancy speaker and microphone in front of me. We're getting the speaker well, so we're hearing the Zoom people really well, but we're not projecting us as well. So you're not seeing everybody in the room as nicely as you could. We'll work on that detail for next time. But primarily what we need to know is that there are 7 of us or 6 of us here at TBS for the first time in about 2 months. It's really great to be in this space. And on Zoom, we can see 4, 8, 11, I'll take myself off, 11 windows. So welcome to our Zoomies and our roomies. I'm going to ask you, if you're here, to pick up a blue book and turn to page 338. And Ezra is going to lead us in our song for today. The song today is about 3 things. All Shlosha Devarim. It's about Torah, prayer, and doing good deeds. Ezra, take it away.
Of course. So for those of you on Zoom, I am now sharing my screen so you can see the lyrics. And this song, again, I'll sing through and I'll invite you all to sing with me. This song goes, Al Shlosha Devarim, Al Shlosha Devarim, Al Shlosha Devarim, Holam Omed. Al HaTorah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al gemilut chasadim. Al HaTorah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al gemilut chasadim. Al Shlosha Devarim, Al Shlosha Devarim, Al Shlosha Devarim, Holam Omed. Al HaTorah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al gemilut chasadim. Al HaTorah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al gemilut chasadim.
You're muted, Rabbi.
Thanks. So I'm going to ask everyone but Ezra to stay muted for the moment. And as you ask questions or Ezra asks a question for you, you can take yourselves off mute, but we want to kind of keep the background noise to a roar. So Ezra may, or I might ask you guys to mute as we're kind of checking your microphones quickly. Additionally, Zoomers, if you need to get my attention, you can certainly do it in the chat. You can raise your hand, the function. You can also connect with Ezra privately. So Ezra knows that they can jump into my conversation insert themselves. So if we need to have someone come in off mute, let's have Ezra be the voice that does that. And then Ezra can open up the conversation for a question or a thought that needs to be heard. I will give you kind of a little bit of history on the bias of this. We've been doing Torah study here at Temple Beth Shalom in these hybrid situations for a couple months. And I will tell you, I do get a little bit lost with the people in the room. I spend a lot of time looking at them and not as much time looking at the people on Zoom. So I've told Ezra that to just keep me on my toes, to say, hey, the Zoom folks have a question. We can always shift gears and rearrange ourselves. Okay. I'm going to first let Jody into our room and then talk about the song. We just read All Shloshah Devarim. The world stands upon three things, according to the rabbis. Stands upon Torah, stands on avodah, which is prayer, or their euphemism for prayer, and on doing good deeds. If we do these three things, if we can study Torah, if we can connect in our communities and pray, and then if we can take the energy, the strength, the courage we get from these acts, we then ought to bring them outward to the world that needs it. And so it becomes almost a circle. Once we do the first, it leads to the second, it leads to the third, and then you start again. And so we're already beginning in this rabbinic text from Pirkei Avot, beginning to see kind of a different perspective on how to do Jewish. The rabbis are going to reinvent Judaism in a radical upheaval, just like the early Christians are going to reinvent what they understand for their community around what the Old Testament means for them. The rabbis are going to be reinventing biblical Judaism in a dramatic way, and that's going to be kind of our agenda today, is to figure out what that reinvention, that reforming, reconstructing of Judaism is going to be all about. Before we dive in too far, though, I want to give you all a chance to check in. And so first I'm going to check in with the folks here in the room, and then we'll check in with the folks in on Zoom. So something new or good in the past week, and just keep it short. And Zoomers, if you want to put your new or good in the chat, that would be great. So just we'll take a couple from the room, and then we'll take a couple from Zoom. So who has something new or good to offer?
I turned 16 last Friday.
Mazel tov. That's very exciting. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
Okay. One more from the room. Anyone has a new or good? Laura.
My sister and I booked a cruise to the Western Mediterranean for October. We're being very optimistic.
That's great. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Ezra if you can share some of the stuff cropping up in our chat.
We have someone saying that they had their family over for dinner last night. That was very nice. And someone else made plans for a weekend trip with friends.
Excellent. Okay. All right, folks.
Rabbi, I couldn't get it on chat because I don't know how to, I couldn't get it in. My mom celebrated her 97th birthday.
Amazing, David. That's great. Mazel tov. Okay. I want to just add that I received a couple questions by email from PJ and a few others. I will come to those when we get to our Q&A section at the end. So if you do have big questions that crop up during the week or on the reading, we can address them. So PJ asked a question about the Whoopi Goldberg comments from earlier in this week, and we'll take a quick pass at that at the end. We'll have a big hour and a half on the Holocaust and Holocaust stuff in a couple of months, but we'll take a few minutes on that, PJ. But before I will go too far deep, I want to see if there's any questions about the reading that cropped up. We're reading about the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Midrash, the rabbinic literature that comes as a commentary to the Torah and the Hebrew Bible. And so just seeing if there's any quick questions regarding the readings. Okay, so hopefully if there are questions that crop up, I'll answer them or touch on them as we move through. And then if you have questions that rise up, we'll certainly have a couple Q&A sessions a short one about halfway through, and then a longer one at the end today. All right. Let me get my notes together. There we go. So I want to take us back to an idea about the rabbis reinventing Judaism. I want to pick it up with that idea. And I'm going to start this thought from about the time of Jesus. So we think the historical character of Jesus lived from about the year 4 BCE to about the year 30 or 32 of the Common Era, give or take. What we know is about 30 years later, around 70 of the Common Era, the Second Temple is destroyed. So in both situations, the death of Jesus and the destruction of the temple, we've got this major upheaval going on for both the Jews who are going to continue Jewish practices, as well as the early Christians who are developing early Christian practices. What we can say as a starting point is all of those early Christians were Jewish. All of them were Jewish to start. The first 50, 75 years of early Christianity was Shabbat and kosher food, and you go to synagogue and you pray 3 times a day, and you're doing the Jewish thing. And that's kind of interesting. For the Christian folks in the room, we can clearly say that what Jesus was practicing 2,000 years ago was an early form of rabbinic Judaism. He was a completely traditional, observant Jew, maintaining the practices and then revolutionizing them because as a rabbinic voice, he wanted to make changes. And we can see that there's been a long tradition, both before Jesus, through Jesus, and later, of rabbis and rabbinic voices adapting and expanding and shifting and changing the legal boundaries. So the first thing I want to say about this character of Jesus is, from my perspective as a rabbi, while I don't believe Jesus was God, I do believe there was a wise character walking around ancient Israel 2,000 years ago who was very similar in his teachings to other rabbis at the time. And so I view Jesus as a type of a rabbi. That puts a very interesting perspective on Jesus, that Jesus was a rabbinic voice alongside a variety of other rabbinic voices of his time. One of the things I like to think about regarding this idea of Jesus as a rabbi was, who were his teachers? Who were the people he learned from about rabbinic Judaism? Was he studying with Hillel and Shammai, the ancient rabbis who were developing the earliest rabbinic texts? Likely, right? We can date Shammai and Hillel to living a little bit before the time of Jesus. And so Jesus would have been familiar with their teachings and likely was studying at their knee, just like the other rabbinic students would have been studying at the table of Hillel and Shammai. Okay, the next point I want to make about these rabbinic characters and what they're doing is there are not a lot of them. There's not thousands of rabbis or even hundreds of rabbis. There's probably a small group. Actually, for those of us who are here at Temple Beth Shalom, we're at round tables. And I'm going to use the metaphor of wisdom circles. We know that 150 years before Jesus, the Greeks were controlling ancient Israel. And if we go back to Greek culture, in Greek culture, you had a variety of wisdom circles, maybe one table with the poets. And the poets would share their amazing poetry with each other. And another table were the scientists sharing science. And a third table were the grammarians doing grammar. And a fourth table, maybe the drama folks performing on the stage. We can imagine in these different wisdom circles, a kind of a guild, 10, 15 people pushing each other to do the best poetry, the best wisdom, the best science. We can imagine alongside these Greek wisdom circles, another wisdom circle of Hillel and Shammai and a few other rabbis trying to figure out what to do with this Jewish stuff as the sacrificial system is coming to an end. Because it didn't just end in 70, it had begun to lose its popularity decades before. We also know through the writings of Jesus and his disciples that people started going to synagogue in and around Tiberias, in and around Jerusalem, at about 100 years before the destruction of the temple. We don't know how many synagogues there were before the temple was destroyed. Some guess 2, some guess 3, there could be 4. The best guess is that there was one in Tiberias, there was one in Jerusalem, and there was another in Alexandria, Egypt. And that these 3 large synagogue places were places for the Jews to have their Shabbat gatherings where they could read the Torah together. They could then read the prophetic reading, the Haftorah, because the Greeks began outlawing the Torah readings. And they probably started developing a prayer practice. We know from some of the archaeology at these ancient synagogues that one thing that used to be on the walls of the synagogue was the 10 Commandments. We go, oh, that's interesting. That was probably in the daily liturgy, that they would somehow recite the 10 Commandments. We also know the early Christians were big folks dedicated to the 10 Commandments as a form of liturgy. And we also know the rabbis were not. For whatever reason, in the oldest prayer books, the 10 Commandments are never part of the liturgical recitation. Maybe they saw it as an early Christian thing. Maybe they saw it as too simplified, saying that we have 613 mitzvot, not 10. So not quite clear like why it seemed to have been part of our liturgy and then loses favor for some reason. But if we're trying to think like, what did it look like at the time of Jesus and the early rabbis, we can imagine one of the things they were reciting when they went to shul on Shabbat morning was the 10 Commandments. We also know these were beautiful locations, really great architecture with lovely tiles and really wonderful settings. We also know that at this time, as these wisdom circles were developing, that the rabbinic voices have a couple different of their own perspectives. They're the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We even know of the ascetics who wind up in Qumran and write the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so let me speak about these 3 groups for a moment. I won't go in too much into the weeds because there's a lot to be said. I don't want to spend too much time.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
if you could put the mic closer to you, when you turn your head, we lose audio quality.
Okay, sure thing. So we'll try that. The Pharisees is another name of the ancient rabbis. And the ancient rabbi, the word Pharisee means the explainers. The Sadducees are the lineage of Tzadok, meaning the Tzadok was the lineage of Aaron the priest. And the group in Qumran, the ascetics in Qumran who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, were likely not part of either group. They were probably very pious and very dedicated to exact practices. What we do know from that group, the folks in Qumran, is that they have some of the earliest versions of the Hebrew Bible in existence. They have long manuscripts of major sections of Isaiah and Jeremiah and many books of the Hebrew Bible that got buried in caves and were discovered in 1948. So one of the great archaeological finds in 1948 was these caves in near the Dead Sea, where this ascetic group had buried their stuff 2,000 years beforehand. We've just begun to kind of date these documents scientifically, and they're dating to be about 100 years before Jesus. That's really interesting because many folks thought they were contemporary to Jesus. And it turns out actually they've been in existence a solid century beforehand. So Len, I'm going to ask you to hold off questions for a few minutes and then we'll kind of take some questions. The other point I want to make about this time is we know of the Maccabees at around 165 BCE, where they were arguing with the Greeks and actually going to war with the Greeks. We can also see that as a type of a Jewish civil war. That what they do once they win the war, they corrupt the priesthood. They decide, instead of going with the idea of one of Aaron's children being the appropriate priest in the synagogue or at the Second Temple in Jerusalem, that they're going to give it to their best friend, because we see political folks do that all the time right now. They're giving their powerful gifts of prestige and honor of roles to their best friends instead of the best candidate, the best person for the job. Like, that's a corruption of government. The Maccabees had many good sides to them. They were great warriors. They were not the best governors. They were corrupt, and they corrupted their own government. And one of their corruptions was to give over the priesthood in Jerusalem to not one of Aaron's lineage, but to a best friend. So when Jesus is walking around 2,000 years ago complaining about the corruption of the priesthood, he was right. It had been corrupted, and it had been corrupted for 150 years by the time he was criticizing it. And there are other criticizers of this corruption, including the Dead Sea Scroll folks in Qumran about 100 years before Jesus. Okay. So we're talking about these wisdom circles. We can imagine alongside a Jewish wisdom circle of Hillel and Shammai and other rabbinic characters, that at the time of Jesus, there's probably a new wisdom circle that crops up that could be the early Christians who want to take this beyond a Jerusalem-centered model to go out to Rome, to go out to Athens, to go out to other places that are not based in the land of Israel. And we could think through, I'm not a Christian scholar to figure out who's in that wisdom circle, but we could see that Paul and the others could be developing that Christian wisdom circle that develops out of some of the Jewish ideas and is going to go in a new direction. Okay. All right. I want to then now present two different word pictures to you. This first one is kind of the stereotype of how we have thought of the early Christians and the rabbinic Jews alongside each other, and what kind of relationship they might have had. One of the ways to think about it from a stereotype, and this is all stereotypes, this isn't perfect, but it's just a way to begin to think about it, is that the ancient Bible, the Hebrew Bible, was the grandfather of the story. And that the grandfather has a child, and the child becomes the early Christians and rebels against the father, right? The child rebels against, and in rebellion goes off in a new direction. And then the grandson, we'll say Muhammad, as the grandson, returning in rebellion against Christianity back to Judaism, might prefer the old ways over the new ways. And so there's a wonderful book by Samuel Butler, who's a British writer about 200 years ago, called The Way of All Flesh. And he maps out these three generations of the grandfather, the father, and the son, that the son in ancient England would rebel against the father and go back to the ways of the grandfather. So one of the ways to think about Judaism, Christianity, Islam might be from this grandfather, father, and son relationship. That's one way. I think there's actually perhaps a slightly more improved generalization that I have begun to talk about recently. There's a scholar named Daniel Boyarin. Daniel Boyarin works at UC Berkeley. And what he wants to develop is a more specific role, both for the early Christians and the rabbinic Jews. And he wants to say the Hebrew Bible is the parent. So it keeps that model. And that the parent has fraternal twins. They're not exact twins, they're fraternal twins. They've got some of the same genetic makeup, some of it is different. They don't look a lot alike, they look like siblings, but they're not identical twins. And one of these fraternal twins is the early Christians, and the other fraternal twin is the early rabbis, and that they actually share some of the same genetic information, meaning the Hebrew Bible, but they've got two completely different perspectives on where they're going. And it looks a little bit different depending on how each of these two twins develop. And I do think there's something very candid and straightforward in that model. It's not rejecting one or the other, even privileging one or the other, it's saying we're getting the same stuff from the same source, and we're taking it off into slightly different directions. Okay. I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'll open it up to a couple quick questions, and then we'll kind of go through a timeline of all this stuff. The last thing I want to say before our timeline on our questions is what we think of as modern Judaism today is rabbinic Judaism. I want you to really soak that in. Everything we do as American Jews today is based on what the rabbis do to reformulate Judaism 2,000 years ago. We still read the Torah, they did too, but we do not practice with a high priest in Jerusalem sacrificing a sheep on Saturday morning because that's what the high priest used to do. We don't practice like the high priest on Yom Kippur because all of those practices around the sacrificial system get replaced. And we'll kind of get into how the rabbis come up with these substitutes for the metaphors of the sacrificial system. They replace it with prayer. So I want you to pull out your smartphone for a second. Just hold it up and then put it upside down on your table in front of you. Your smartphone is a new technology. It is an improvement on the last technology. You can do many more things with your smartphone than you can do with this laptop. You can do some of the same things, but because it's smaller, it's stronger, and it's more portable, you can actually do a lot more things with the phone than you could with the laptop of 20 years hence. So in the idea that the new tool, the new technological tool is giving you a lot of convenience and a lot of portability, I want you to think with that model to this next piece. The sacrificial system that existed for 1,000 years was the ancient technology that ancient Israel used to get close to God. That technology became outdated. And at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, the new technology that replaces the sacrificial system is the prayer book. It's portable. You can take it with you. You don't need this in Jerusalem. It's nice if you haven't, but you can have this in Rome. You can have this here in Hudson. You can move around with this. And so what we see is the transition from the sacrificial system to prayer is actually a technological revolution. They're going to take the sacrificial system, the ancient rabbis, and they're going to map it onto our prayers. On Shabbat, we have two prayers that are correlated to the two offerings that are given on Saturday morning at the temple. We have a third prayer in the afternoons called Mincha, which is also based on the ancient sacrificial system. So all of our prayer structure is based on the sacrificial structure. It becomes almost a direct correlation to those ancient sacrifices. We see also that the rabbis are going to do the same thing with the holidays. They're going to say, hey, we're going to still do the holidays, but now we're going to do something different for Passover. Passover used to bring your sheep and you go to Jerusalem. Now you're going to keep your sheep in your own home. and you'll keep your goat in your home. You can have dinner at your home because your home becomes the altar site. Every home, the table, the dining table, becomes the altar for this new rabbinic Judaism. So if you keep Shabbat, you, the homemaker, the parent in the home, gets to be the new high priest. They control what happens with the Jewish observances in the home. It's no longer the priest who has any power, because the priest actually has no power. The rabbis come in as teachers to try and teach us how to live in this home-based system and what will happen in this home-based system. One more thing about this revolution that the rabbis are kind of creating on the fly. It's a series of survival skills. They're trying to reinvent Judaism really on the fly because they don't have a choice. If they don't reinvent it quickly, it's going to die. They know that. And so the other thing that they kind of build as a leg for their survival, right? If we talked about in the song Al Shlosha Devarim, on three things we stand: on Torah, on prayer, and on doing good kindnesses. The fourth corner of that table is education. Every child must be a scholar, no questions asked. Every child, boy and girl, must fall in love with learning, must be dedicated to learning, because if the children learn, then the survival is working. And we, as children of the rabbis, for 2,000 years, have been dedicated to raising children who are going to be scholars. And all of a sudden, it's beginning to click. Oh yeah, we really have done it. We have been so hyper-focused on building a warm home and the three parts of that song, and on dedicating ourselves to the educational wellness of our children. And then implied in these four things alongside this is community. That all of this is predicated on having a healthy, strong, viable community, local community, that in every locality you'd have a community to take care of the group's needs, take care of what happens, and make sure the group has what it needs. Okay, that's the big meta picture. And before I dive into a bit of the timeline, Len, I saw a question a few minutes ago. Do you want to ask it up now?
Yes, we keep on hearing about the Torah. We keep on hearing about other documents and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Jews like to learn. But I'm wondering if it's anything like it is today. Was there a huge amount of illiteracy back then? And therefore, the rabbis had a strong grasp on what Judaism was, and nobody else could question it because they couldn't read.
Yeah, it's a good question. What we know about the education about 2,000 years ago is two things. We know that, as I mentioned last time, the oral repetition of long bodies of text were still very popular. That you would, as a young person, memorize a lot of text. And so I do think this oral repetition was still a popular educational model. But what we also know is about 2,000 years ago, our literacy was getting dramatically better. We were still memorizing lots of text, and we were beginning to read. Now, what we were reading was language specific. We were reading Rabbinic Hebrew, and we were reading Aramaic. We weren't reading Biblical Hebrew. So the specific things that we were reading were the Rabbinic Hebrew of the Mishnah, the Rabbinic Hebrew of the Midrash, the Rabbinic Hebrew in the prayer book, and of the Passover Haggadah. We were not so much reading the Hebrew Bible. That was for the elites, the educated elites who could read the Hebrew Bible in its crazy grammatical nuances for us. So I do think at this time when the rabbis are developing this deep, anxious focus on education, literacy has become very popular because the Greeks were big readers and the Romans were big readers. So culturally, reading literacy had been very popular for a while. Okay. I did see, Ezra, could you restate the question about Jewish monasticism? I want to kind of answer that quick question.
Of course. The question is there a monastic tradition in Judaism?
No. On one foot, yeah, no, Jews are not monastic, we're community-based. Monastic are people who live alone in monasteries, praying in silence, and right. So that Jews don't pray alone for long stretches of time. We do meditation in different ways, but we do all of this meditation alongside communal obligations. So there is no monastic tradition. There are people who have spiritual journeys that do perhaps a long period of silence, but there is no celebration of a monastic practice in Judaism for all the reasons that it goes against the communal norms and the educational norms and survival norms that I just outlined. Okay. Ezra, any other?
I can't stop myself. You're saying that Jews don't monkey around.
What's that, Len? I hear you.
Jews don't monkey around.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you. Very funny. Okay, Ezra, if you could go ahead and share our timeline, and I'm going to walk us through a little bit of the timeline and some of the texts that are there, and then we're going to do a bit of text study together. You guys can see that, although if someone wants to play with the to make that a little bit sharper, Laura, if you wanted to, that's relatively sharp. Okay. Ezra, I'm going to ask you if you could scooch the timeline down towards the bottom of the page, of this first page, and yeah, right there. Good. So actually, why don't you go up a couple more lines? Good. All right, I'm going to pick it up here in 164 with the rededication of the temple. And this is the Maccabees becoming powerful at the time of the Greeks. This is the Hashmonaim is the academic name we call the Maccabees. The Hashmonaim become rulers for 100 years. So for 100 years, the Maccabees are the kings of Jerusalem. They're running the show there. At the time also, the Romans replaced the Greeks. And so Rome becomes the new lords of the land. And the Jews have to then begin to develop relationships with the Roman folks at this time. Jesus is born around 4 BCE. We also see on the right column, this is worth noting, what gets written at this time. So at 167, 164, we have the book of Maccabees. There's actually 4 of these books writing the historical accounts of the Maccabees. The book of Esther, Daniel, Ruth, Song of Songs are all written about this time, or finished, redacted at this time. The book of Daniel is interesting for the Christian folks, so think about it for a second. Daniel is of a prophet who's thinking about messianic end of times. Those end of times messianic characters who are going to lead the world to a perfected place. Daniel develops that idea beyond any other of the Hebrew Bible writers. And so that is seen if we compare the prophets we studied last week, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, as being ancient prophets from 500 years before Jesus. Daniel could only be maybe 100 or 50, 150 years before Jesus. Daniel is also previewing much of the Jesus ideas. Now, we don't know if Jesus is going to historically fulfill Daniel's prophecy or if that gets layered onto him by the literary additions of the disciples. But we do see Daniel as a model for a new messianic character. Up until the time of Daniel, The Messianic literature has been about not redeeming individuals, but redeeming the nation. Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah wanted to redeem the entire people, for them to come back and get a second chance. This individual redemption really becomes a Daniel idea. And because so much of Christian theology is based in this individual redemption piece, a lot of Christian scholars want to use Daniel as kind of like that new voice into this idea. Okay. All right, we can come now into 70 CE as the destruction of the temple. At the time, at the time of Jesus being born and then the destruction of the temple, we have some early rabbinic writings that are developing. We don't quite know how they developed, but we know in the year 200 of the Common Era, a new book is printed, a new scroll is written, and that's called the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a Hebrew law code of the rabbinic voices of this time. And likely the first drafts of these are being written at the time of Jesus. So the Mishnah is probably our most ancient Hebrew literature besides the Hebrew Bible. And also alongside the early Mishnah texts of Hillel and Shammai, which would predate Jesus, we also get what's called Midrash. Midrash are commentaries on the Torah stories that help explain some of the weirdness in the Torah story. Like, how can we imagine the gaps in the story? So let's just pick a famous story and pick some of the gaps. Let me just think for a second. So I've got a favorite one. Abraham and his cousin Lot are trying to survive. Lot and his wife are there at Sodom and Gomorrah. Abram has two cousins who are children of Lot and his wife. And we don't know much about Lot's wife. We don't know much about these two girls that they had in their family. And so a midrash might be the story of the childhood of these two girls, how they survived incest with their father, what they did to keep their wits about them, right? That would be a midrash on Lot's daughters. It becomes almost a fantasy. And so depending on how we think of these fantasies, whether we think they're divinely inspired or whether we think they're just fantastical literature, the rabbis are engaging in this deep storytelling to explain the gaps in the stories, and so is Jesus. And I want you to take that in for a moment. That if we look at the literature of Jesus, the wisdom tales, the parables, what Jesus is claimed to have written, alongside what Hillel and Shammai wrote, we can go, oh, they are writing the same kind of literature. Well, of course they are. They're in the same wisdom circles. They're hanging out together. Yes, they're writing the same literature. They know each other. It makes sense that they would actually be reading each other's stories and commentaries and be citing them, and occasionally they do. So what we can begin to see is that the writings of Jesus and his disciples seem a lot like the writings of the rabbis of this time. And of course they are, right? But going back to that fraternal twins, right? One's got one agenda about revising the community to keep it alive, and the other has a completely different agenda about bringing this out to the entire globe and doing this for all the people who have no relationship to ancient Israel, to any person who falls in love with these salvation stories. So the agendas wind up being very different in perspective, but we can say they're all coming from the same genre of literature. Okay, couple more details of this time. In 73 CE, Masada falls. Masada was like the last stronghold for the ancient Israelites. It is destroyed. A number of them commit suicide. During the 60 years between the fall of Masada and the Bar Kokhba rebellion, we do get a rebellion that slowly develops over the next 60 years almost a messianic rebellion, that this guy, Bar Kokhba, can somehow save the day. And he doesn't. The Roman army is too much for him. And they put down his rebellion after a couple of years. And the rabbis lose heart. They lose any sense that they're ever going back to Jerusalem, that they're ever going back to ancient sacrificial systems. And they now just focus in on this new idea of rabbinic Judaism. In the year 200, the rabbis composed their first legal code. And this is the Mishnah. And then about 200 years later, they create a commentary on this law code. The Mishnah is a very concise, short text. It's a series of like paragraphs. They're short, brief. They're supposed to be. The commentary on these short paragraphs is more long-winded. It's explanatory. It's detailed. It's giving some meat on the bones. It's giving some more literary context for the explanations. This addition to the Mishnah is called the Gemara in Hebrew, and that's the Gemara and the Mishnah together are called the Talmud. So when people talk about the Talmud of the rabbis, what they're saying is it's a combination of the Mishnah text and the commentary on the Mishnah, and that is both two together are the Talmud. They finished this about 500. There are two Talmuds, one in 400, one in 500. The first one is written in Palestine, in Jerusalem. It's called the Yerushalmi. The second one is written in Babylonia, near Baghdad. They're similar, but the Babylonian one is more exhausting. The Babylonian one, I think, is 37 tractates. The Jerusalem one, I think, is about 17 tractates. So you can begin to see that rabbis have really big bookcases with lots and lots of books. This is where we're getting all these books from. And then our final entry here is the life of the Prophet Muhammad, about 570, happening in and around the Middle East. Muhammad intersects with both early Christians and the rabbis, and develops their perspective on prophetic understandings at that time. Ezra, I'm going to ask you if you're not going to go to the next page, and if we can read a few of these texts together. So let's see, let me make this a little bit smaller for us. No, it's too small. Let's go. So I'm just going to call out some readers to read a couple of these texts. And go to the first one. So Sydney, if you could read the first one, 0 CE Hillel Shama.
During a period of religious and political turmoil under Roman rule, various interpretations of Judaism competed for primacy. The priestly tradition of the
Sadducees.
tended to align itself with the ruling power. The scribal traditions of the Pharisees, represented by sages such as Hillel and Shammai, later emerged as
Rabbinic
Judaism, from which all major contemporary forms of Judaism derive.
Okay. Jennifer, if you could read, we'll skip Philo and let's just go to the destruction of the second temple in 70.
Sure. I have it here in front of me. So,
Yeah.
Following the outbreak of the Jewish War in the 6th Common Era, the Roman armies began the reconquest of Judea. In 70 CE, the Roman general Titus entered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. 3 years later, the Jewish rebels, called Zealots, made their last stand at Mountain Fortress in Masada. With the destruction of the temple, the mass suicide of the rebels in the face of the anticipated capture of the slavery, the very survival of Judaism was in danger. In response, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai moved to Sanhedrin.
Move the Sanhedrin.
Rabbinical council from the siege of Jerusalem of the town of Giving. And they're established in Yeshiva, a rabbinic academy for the reconstruction of Jerusalem.
So let me talk a little bit about this story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He's in Jerusalem when Jerusalem falls. and he's trapped. And he finds a way out by hiding in a coffin. They smuggle the coffin out, and he tells the guards that they need to leave Jerusalem and set up a new study center in Tiberias, in Yavne. This is where they're going to relocate their learning center out of Jerusalem. And so he's saved through this hiding in the coffin gesture, and the coffin's taken up to Tiberias, where he then develops his new learning center, his yeshiva. I'm going to ask one of our Zoomers, let's see, David Traub, why don't you read for us 200 CE, the completion of the Mishnah? David, you have to take yourself off mute.
With two more unsuccessful revolts against Rome, the Dysphoria revolt in 114-17 and the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132-35 CE, the military option was exhausted and rabbinic activity was redoubled. Following the martyrdom of Rabbi Akiva and his disciples, the Sanhedrin and a succession of academics moved to the Galilee in a 140 CE. 2 generations later, around 200 CE, the curriculum of the yeshiva was redacted into the first compendium of Jewish law, the Mishnah.
Good, thank you, David. All right, I'm going to ask Ezra if you could now move to our text study. We're going to do a little bit of text study together. And this text is from Pirkei Avot, which is a Talmudic text. It's on our next page. And so if you've got the link, you can see it there. And I'm going to, let's see, there we go. Here. So I think because my microphone, I'm going to ask some of our Zoomers if we can read this aloud together. So we're just going to read, I think, this first page together, and then we'll read the second page in our small groups. So let's see. I'm going to ask Len Rose if you could read Aleph number 1, Moses received. Len, can you hear me? Oh, he might be out. All right. So Joy Wagner, why don't you take number 1, Moses received the Torah? Joy must not be there. We'll try Janet. Janet, go ahead and read for us number 1.
Okay, sorry, I had to unmute myself. Moses received the Torah from Sinai and gave it over to Joshua. Joshua gave it over to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets gave it over to the men of the great assembly. They, the men of the great assembly, would always say these 3 things: be cautious in judgment, establish many pupils, and make a safety fence around the Torah.
Here we see in this famous opening to this text that this ideal is that it goes from Moses to the prophets to the next generation, and almost on a continuous chain until it gets all the way to Hillel, right? So we've got this unbroken chain of folks who are going to be taking not just the Torah, but these commentaries, these additions, these new understandings alongside them. Let me go down to the next reader. Kate, if you could read for us number 2 about Shimon the righteous.
Yeah, Shimon the righteous was among the last surviving members of the Great Assembly. He would say, the world stands on 3 things: Torah, the service of God, and deeds of kindness.
And if we look carefully at Kate's in the Hebrew, there's our song. All shlosha devarim ha'olam omed al haTorah v'al ha'avodah v'al gimilut hasadim, and all of a sudden we're back to that opening moment. Okay, Amy, if you could read for us number 6, Joshua the son of Parachia and Nitai the Arbalite.
Joshua, the son of Parachia, and Nitai the Arbalite, received from them. Joshua, the son of Parachia, would say, assume for yourself a master, acquire for yourself a friend, and judge every man to the side of merit.
Okay. And Ezra, if you could scooch the screen down so we can go to our next one, which is number 10. Okay. PJ, if you could read for us number 10, Shmaya and Avtalion.
Shemaiah and Avtalion received from them. Shemaiah would say, love, work, loathe mastery over others, and avoid intimacy with the government.
Okay, good. And let's see, Jody Byrne, if you could read for us number 12, Hillel and Shammai received.
Hillel and Shammai received from them. Hillel would say, be of the disciples of Aaron, a lover of peace, a pursuer of peace, one who loves the creatures and draws them close to Torah.
Great. And Jade, if you could read for us number 13, he would also say.
He would also say, one who advances his name destroys his name. One who does not increase diminishes. One who does not learn is deserving of death, and one who make personal use of the crown of Torah shall perish. Okay, so here is your assignment. In a moment, we're going to break up into small groups. And what I want you to do is go over all of these texts. That was the first page of text. There's a second page that is added in. You're going to have about 5 minutes to read through them. And the question to each one of you is, which one of these makes most sense to you? Which one do you hold as being really essential to your life? Like if you had to say, on these 3 things, my life exists, which one of these might you choose? Okay. Ezra, if you could take our Zoomers and put them into breakout rooms, and then I'm going to have one group here, and we'll come back in about 5 minutes. So why don't we all come to this table here? And why don't the 3 of you look on that side, and the 2 of you can look on this, and I can look on mine.
Person who's labeled Zoom user, what is your name?
I guess that's me, Julie Lakis.
Okay.
I don't know why my name's not on there. It should be. Are we the only 2 here?
There are 3 people in this breakout room plus me.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I think our task is to read the second page and then decide which of these speaks to us. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Are we on 14?
Yeah, I think from 14 to 18. The second page of the print.
and judge every man to the side of merit. Mostly I like the idea.
Rabbi, we were closed right in the middle of my question. I was asking if it's true that Muslims are supposed to all memorize the entire Quran,
Yeah, it's a mitzvah to memorize the Quran.
and we don't memorize the Torah.
We used to. We used to.
Oh. Okay.
Would that kind of go along with like when they are like doing all of the songs to help you remember? I think we talked about that last week.
Yeah, for sure, Aaron. I think once you begin memorizing long bodies of text, adding in more songs, think of college, memorize hundreds of songs. It can be done if you just apply yourself. Yeah.
Oh, it's a good thing they didn't count on me because I can't memorize any songs.
All right, let's kind of come back together. I really love these texts. I think they are really, they speak to some of the deep wisdoms of the rabbis, and we can even see in reading them quickly that they almost sound like the wisdom literature of Jesus and the disciples. It's not dramatically different. It's got that same thematic approach towards wisdom literature. And we can, then search about which of our favorites and why. They're very, I think, important texts to us as spiritual seekers, as community builders. And I do think ultimately the last one, the reason I left it there is kind of my hidden agenda is ultimately we can't do community if we aren't actively engaged in the beauty of community building. So I'm not going to dive too much into the details right now because I'm a bit pushed for time. So unfortunately, I'm going to move us out of this amazing text study, and I want to kind of open the floor to some questions about the rabbis and the early Christians and that kind of stuff. And what I want to do is first have Ezra kind of guide some of the questions that they're seeing in the chat to kind of get us started.
Yeah, so there are a few questions in the chat. One person asks, what does avoid intimacy with the government in number 10 mean?
So, think about this, right? If the Jews are not in power, right, in ancient Rome, if they are the minority, how much are you going to trust the majority to take care of your needs? And you still have to go by the law of the government that you're living with. So there is a Talmudic law, a missional law that says you follow the local laws, no matter what. You just don't have to be so intimate with those local governors in case they're anti-Semitic, right? So if we face anti-Semitism, then we have to, pause and say, hey, this isn't, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to always be obedient to the laws, even when they're not our laws. And so I think this is what's called a fence around the Torah. We don't get too close to the government because we don't have any political power, typically, in at least the Roman government, and then by extension, most governments.
Another question in the chat is asking about number 10. What does loving work mean?
I need to call that one up and take another quick run through the text, the Hebrew. So when I get that kind of question, I want to see what the Hebrew tells me, because the Hebrew can somehow hide some of the, so here it's ahov et hamalacha. It's loving your tasks, loving your labor. And so I think you should, if you want to be happy in life, you should do work that you love. I think it's really as simple as that.
Another question is, could you talk about the antagonism towards the Pharisees and the scribes in the gospel writings and the idea that Jesus was likely a Pharisee?
Yeah, it's a Christian polemic, and Christians, this is how Christians base a lot of their antagonism and anti-Semitism is around the role of the Pharisees, and were the Pharisees the killers of Jesus. We'll get into that when we study anti-Semitism. But for a solid 1,000 years, Rome and the Catholic Church did believe that the Pharisees killed Jesus. And so in all of the echoes of that, it's only since 1964 and the Vatican Council in 64, 65, where they finally overturned that. And so I don't want to dive too deep into that because then we really get into all kinds of issues around preaching anti-Semitism from Christian perspectives and all that. We'll get there. We will get there in this class, but I don't need to go too deep into that specific rabbit hole right now. Other questions that are cropping up, Rosa?
Yeah, we've got a decent amount. We've got 2 questions that touch on the monasticism that you mentioned earlier. One person says, could you talk about taking Nazarite vows within Judaism if that's not a form of monasticism?
That's a great question. So there are 2 texts of taking a Nazarite vow, right? We have the story in the book of Numbers where an unidentified person takes that monastic vow and then is welcomed in after he has been has maintained that vow. It seems to be, at least the Torah verses, an argument about alcoholism. What do you do with drunks? What do you do with people who have addictive personalities? And so one reading of that text is when you have someone who has a preclusion to alcohol or drug abuse, there, in that case only, you might want to have some ascetic behaviors to modify their practices. The second version of the Nazarite vow is, of course, the famous story of Samson, who was a Nazir all of his life, and he winds up killing himself because he falls in love with his own power. And so in both of these, we have clear rabbinic commentary that says, we don't do this. We're not ascetics. We don't love the Nazir. Yeah, we may need them in the Torah stories, but this isn't who we are. You really want to do the right thing, the good thing, the proper thing. Maimonides says, you don't go towards gluttony and you don't go towards asceticism, you go towards balance. You balance your life. And so I think that is perhaps the rabbinic response to monasticism. Okay, Ezra, what's our next question?
This question calls back to what you were talking about at the beginning of class, how the Maccabees chose people for the priesthood as friends, asking, were the people they chose for the priesthood still of the tribe of Levi or just any tribe?
They were random from random groups and they were inappropriate. So they were clearly problematic from all they were not Levites, they were not Kohatites, they were not at all fit for the job. And so it was a clear violation of the process. And so as a group dedicated to process, this was a violation of the process.
Next question, someone asks, did kids go to school?
Yeah, they did. And so in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, we get a lot of language about how we are supposed to teach our children. We are supposed to hire teachers to teach our kids. We shouldn't be their teachers. We are supposed to hire local educators who can teach them the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. They're supposed to learn the Torah and the Torah stories, and they're supposed to learn the Mishnah and the Talmud and the laws. So yes, there's like almost an existing curriculum that educators can look at and say, okay, this is what we ought to be teaching our kids, to how they could learn about being part of this community, being members in this community.
There's a question. I feel like this gathering of text feels monastic in a way of being silent and one with yourself. When were these texts introduced?
So the texts that I put out are from a book called Pirkei Avot, which is a Talmudic tractate. These get written about 400. So they have, I want to say, some wisdom literature. They're like other wisdom literature, and that they are they're predicated on spending some time in prayer, predicated on spending some time in meditation. There was a Talmudic text that says when people pray, they should spend an hour in silence, an hour in prayer, and then an hour in silence. And all of a sudden, that's a lot of time. But if one is spending 3 hours of one's morning in silence and then in prayer and then in silence, one can glean, I would imagine, quite a bit of insight about how one is supposed to, conduct oneself throughout the day. And so depending on how we think about these, I do think, while I wouldn't say they're monastic necessarily, they are about being glancing inward, being aware of your own stuff, knowing what's coming up for you in your life and how to discern what you should be concerned about, whether it's through your prayer life or the behaviors that you have. Here in our conversation, we talked a lot about deeds, much more the acts of what we do over the theory of what we do. And so I do think that becomes kind of the Jewish answer to this process of fulfilling the commandments. You define your identity by what you do. Your Jewish identity is defined by the things you do Jewishly, much less than the things you believe in. And so I do think that's like a very nice way to orient oneself around some of these ideas. Okay, Len, I see a hand. Go ahead.
We're talking about education, Jewish education. I'm wondering, when was the advent of a yeshiva burcha, and for how long did they actually have whole towns supporting yeshiva burchas for the rest of their lives?
It's a history question. We'll get there. So we will get to the development of Jewish schooling throughout our different historical models. We can honestly say that schooling was continuous, that there were yeshivot, schools in many Jewish communities, but the idea of paying the wages of the student is rather a modern phenomenon that happens in the last couple hundred years. It was not something that existed 500, 1,000, 1,500 years ago. You didn't get your wages paid for you just because you were a student. That's a new modern phenomenon.
A follow-up. I was just gonna say a follow-up question to what you just answered about the text is, when did the rabbinic texts become more community-based?
Say more about that. Whoever asked that question, come in off of mute and tell me more about that question, because I'm not quite understanding all of it.
You answered my question in the first. More of the language felt very this like prayer and solace and silence and critical reflection and self-reflection. I think you answered my question. It was more about the language of, I think that as a whole, these texts translate into the betterment of the community by doing this for yourself.
Mason, let me add one additional thought as I'm thinking about, let's say, Jewish prayer. And we'll get to this when we have our section on Jewish prayer. That Jewish prayer sits at a very interesting moment where part of Jewish prayer is about what's up for me, and part of Jewish prayer is singing in the plural we. Oh, I'm not praying alone. I'm praying with my community. And so it's always this tension between the communal needs and the individual needs. And sometimes we take time for our own stuff, and sometimes we take time for our community. And I believe that to be the ultimate dance in Judaism is that you're all continuously moving from those individual discernments to the communal needs and trying to figure out that piece. And so I think it's tough. It's not easy because we don't often think about the needs of the community being perhaps even overriding our own needs. But sometimes, especially according to Jewish law, there are times where we do privilege the needs of the community over the individual. It's a great point. Thank you, Mason. Len, go ahead, wrap this up. I think we're just about running out of time.
I'm a little confused about the whole thing of prayer being a sense of community. I think that for conservative and for reform, A lot of the prayer is done as a community. We sing together. We sing the same words at the same moment. And then I go to an Orthodox service and the prayers are said at the same time, but not together at all. Everybody's racing to see who finishes first. And not
Yeah.
everybody, only the men.
Yeah, so we'll get there, Len. That becomes a question about traditional prayer and fulfilling the obligation to say amen to all the blessings or such. That's not necessarily where we're headed in this conversation, but we will get there. So hold that question for our prayer stuff. I'm now going to broaden this out. We're coming up on time. So I want to now go back to PJ's question from earlier in the week about Whoopi Goldberg and her comment. And so before I answer the Whoopi Goldberg question, I do want to call up the reading for this week and talk about that for just a moment. So let me call up our syllabus and we can take a peek at that together. Let me share my screen so we can all see this together. So we are at week 3, which is the rabbinic civilization and Jewish law. We are now next week going to week 4, which is holiness in time, Shabbat, and the spring holidays. We'll be looking at Purim. We won't get to Passover yet in this one. We'll focus on Shabbat and a little bit of Purim next week. The chapter in Essential Judaism is chapter 2. I'm also going to add in some of the text from our other book, the Book of Life by Michael Strassfeld. So either in tonight or tomorrow morning's email where we have the recording link, I'll put out both the reading to read chapter 2. And then for those who want to go deeper, they can read some of Michael Strassfeld's amazing thoughts about Shabbat and the spring holidays. And then you see after that, we're going to get into our first section on God. We'll do a couple sections on God, and then we'll hit for prayer after that. Okay, I'm trying to be respectful of time. So folks who are time crunched, they can head out now. And then if folks want to stay for a few more minutes to ask some other questions, we can go to those. So I'm going to go to PJ's question. PJ, if you could go ahead and restate your question for the group so that we can hear it.
I don't have the article in front of me, but it was in the Akron Beacon Journal. I think it was put through USA Today, which they had content from them. I wasn't going to dwell on the Goldberg remarks so much as this response that this fellow gave. And it was the question of race, I believe, if I'm understanding it. So I won't go deeper because I don't want to misquote, but if I had the article in front of me, I could do that.
So Jonathan Goldblatt is the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, and he wrote this opinion piece for the USA Today, and it was published in a couple variety papers. And basically what he said about Whoopi Goldberg's comments that I will repeat and will repeat again when we get to our section on the Holocaust. 100 years ago, when our grandparents were walking around, even our great-grandparents, so think 1920s, 1930s, Jews were not white folks. Judaism in New York, Cleveland, Detroit, Minneapolis in 1920 was a race. We were understood as a race. My grandmother, my great-grandmother grew up thinking of Judaism as a kind of a race. Whatever that meant, right? In 1920, 1930, it meant that Jews weren't white. Whatever we were, we weren't white. And of course, Adolf Hitler had that same exact idea. Jews were not white, and because they weren't white, we need to get rid of the Jewish problem. The final solution is to eradicate the racial problem known as the Jewish people. So from the lens of history, Whoopi Goldberg just made a mistake. She misspoke. She was thinking more of skin color, perhaps, than from the lens of what either German folks were thinking about 100 years ago, or even American folks were thinking about 100 years ago. That being said, in the last 25 years, there's been great research. There's a book I like called The Price of Whiteness. After World War II, Jews become white, right? We become white folk. And we have to align ourselves along other white folk in the white community. And there's a certain price we pay, losing our status as people of color and becoming white folk. And so I think that becomes more the comment Whoopi Goldberg was trying to make, that she might see most Jews as being white-skinned and white-colored, and therefore needing to perhaps shed their anxieties about the wrongs done to them 80 or 90 years ago, or perhaps not be so worried about them. And of course, if we didn't have anti-Semitism today, she might be right, but we do have anti-Semitism, and it's getting better. It's not, I mean, it's getting worse. It's not getting better. And so what we can also say about racial justice in this question is, Eric Ward, who's an African-American scholar on racism, believes that all racial injustice, all racism as a theory, develops out of anti-Semitism. That if we think of the lens of all of racial folks who are, let's say, a neo-Nazi living in Canton, who wants to kill the Jews in Kent State. From his perspective, that neo-Nazi living in Canton, luckily that guy's in jail, but from his perspective, he's angry at both Black folks, brown folks, queer folks, and Jews. So when we think about the neo-Nazi, the white supremacists, for them, Jews never were white folks. That racial piece still exists for them. And so part of this is to be aware that there are people that don't like the Jews and have begun to shoot us up in our synagogues for the first time in American history, right? It's happened not once, not twice, but now 4 times in 4 years. And so we have to be aware of this growing anti-Semitism, and we have to tend to it. And so when people come and visit Temple Beth Shalom on a Friday night, they are greeted not by a nice rabbi who's going to give them a cup of tea, although I would love to. They're greeted by a security officer who has a gun. My son, who's 10 years old, has been going to synagogues and Jewish day schools for most of his life. And for the last 7 years of his life, the first person he sees at every synagogue and every Jewish day school is a police officer. So when he has to feel safe, he knows there's a police officer outside of his synagogue, outside of his day school, who's going to keep him safe. I dare say most Christians who went to church this morning didn't have that concern as they entered into their safe church. Okay, other questions that we want to ask as we wrap this up, other quick ones. Okay. All right, Len, do I see a hand, or Amy? I saw a flash of a
Just
hand.
a comment. I grew up in the early 50s. I was born in 48, and I grew up believing Jews are a religion. Somebody else calling me a race doesn't make me a race. My forefathers, foremothers, they all came from Poland and Russia. I dare say that makes me sort of a Northern European of sorts. And I don't understand being called a race. I wouldn't call somebody from Ireland a race of Irish. And I wouldn't even call the Aryan race a race. They're just Central Europe, North Central Europe. I don't understand the whole thing about them being a race.
Yeah, and so we're happy, what we're getting, unfortunately, Len, is a very misidentified approach to ethnicity. What we are seeing is that ethnicity is dying in America. It's been dying for 50 years. And as ethnicity dies and it becomes replaced by racial politics, we don't quite know what to do with our ethnic identities. And so I do think it becomes a very deep piece of anxiety if we are Irish, if we are German, if we are a different ethnicity. Do we see Judaism as only an ethnicity? Maybe. Do we see it only as a religion? Maybe. Do we see it only as a race? Maybe. And all of a sudden, oh, it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of, and it's a little bit of a lot of things. And it defies almost all the specific pigeonholes that we want, because all those pigeonholes are Christian pigeonholes. That the Christian concept of religion might not necessarily fit on the Jewish perspective of what religion is. Right? It's a Christian frame. It's a Christian definition. Amy, go ahead.
So the thing that I find perplexing about this is I think that the importance of this was that it somehow, by making the comment that the Holocaust was not about race, it sort of implies that Jews should therefore stop being so worried about being Jews and how they're going to be treated, because they really are part of the larger society. And so what's the big deal anymore? And what it makes me think is that the reality is that when you belong to a group, however that group is defined, whether it says race or national identity or religion, you can suffer. It's kind of like saying, well, women are a part of society, so therefore the fact that the Taliban is in charge in Afghanistan now shouldn't be a big deal to women, because so what? In this country, women are treated relatively equally. You're not safe for a woman in certain places.
Final comment about Whoopi Goldberg, and Whoopi Goldberg is not considered to be anti-Semitic by any stretch of the imagination. She has over and over again proven that she has aligned her as a supporter of the Jewish people.
Absolutely. She's got a Jewish last name.
So none of this is construed as being anything more than a misstatement, or perhaps speaking off of the top of her head instead of from a carefully considered perspective. And Jonathan Goldblatt goes to that perspective in the article. Okay, thank you for a fascinating conversation about the rabbis. I love the rabbis, so I'm always delighted. We'll be learning a little more about the rabbis when we talk about prayer as well. So we'll be coming back to them also around the holidays. So the Shabbat stuff, we'll get to reprise some of the rabbinic innovations around that.
Go home and have dinner.
And by the way, maybe Whoopi is also a Jewish first name.
Maybe. Okay, guys. Quick announcement. This Friday night, Temple Beth Shalom will have a hybrid in-person and a Zoom service. So if you feel bold enough to join us in person, you're welcome Friday night at 7:30. If you want to join us on Zoom, you can do that as well. Have a great week. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye, everyone.